All right, so moving on in our full stack application, we've added a create endpoint. So the next thing we're going to do is add an update endpoint. Okay, so let's open up our server file, and the update endpoint for our notes is going to look like this. We're going to say app.put, right, because update endpoints generally use put requests. And the URL here is going to be /notes/ and then the ID of the note that we want to update. Okay, so we'll use a URL parameter there, and that can basically take any value. Now, inside this callback here for our route, what this is going to look like is we're going to have to get the updates that the user wants to apply to that note from the request body and apply it to the note with that ID. Now, the actual logic for this is going to look very similar to what we saw inside our notes provider. In fact, we'll probably even just be able to copy and paste this code that we have inside of here with notes.map. But basically what we're going to have to do is start off by getting the note ID from the URL parameter, which we can do like this. We're going to say const note ID equals request.params. And we're going to get the updates from the request body by saying const title and content equals request.body. All right. So now all we have to do is replace the title and content of the note with this ID with the things that we just got out of the request body. So to do that, we're going to, you know what, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this, this code from here. It should work almost perfectly with one or two minor changes. I'm going to cut that out of there, paste that in here, and what we should be able to do now is say notes equals notes.map, and we want to check if the note ID is equal to the note ID URL parameter here, so we'll just change that here, note ID. There we go. If note ID is equal to the note ID URL parameter, then we're going to return a new note with ID equal to note ID and title and content equal to the updates that were in request body. All right. And then when we're done, just like we did inside our create endpoint here, we're going to send back the updated notes array by saying response.json notes. And now our endpoint should be working enough for us to make this request from the front end. So let's open up our front end, and we're going to replace the logic that's inside update note with a put request to that endpoint we just created. So I guess we'll just start off with a try catch block. We're going to say try const response equals await axios dot put. We're going to send that to the endpoint /notes/ and then insert the ID, which we're getting as an argument inside our update note function. And as the body, we're going to include the title and content of our notes. So let's say title, content, and those will be easily accessible from inside our endpoint. So next up, what we're going to do, now that we have the updated notes in our response, we're going to do the same thing as we did inside our create note function by saying set notes response.data, and then we'll just catch any errors that occur. And again, in reality, you'd probably want to alert the user that something went wrong, but for now, we're just going to log out that error to the console by saying console.log e, and that should be all we need to do for updating a note. Let's try this one out now by going to our application, which should be already running in the background. I forgot to put the await keyword. Let's add that here. Await, or async keyword rather. Async is what we want. Oh my goodness, there we go. Async, can't type today. Cool, so let's open up a note here and edit it. And you might have noticed that our data actually reset. And the reason for that is, of course, that our server reset when we made changes to it. So what I'm going to do is just open up my first note. We're going to try and add some different things to it. We can add a single line of code here if we want to. Hello world, something like that. And it does that by making an update request to the server. So the last thing we're going to do now is implement a delete endpoint. And to do that, we're just going to say app.delete. And we're going to say /notes/note ID, very similar to what we did up here in our update endpoint. Let's just make sure we have the casing there correct. And then we're going to say request response. And essentially, we're going to use the same logic inside of here that we did inside our delete note function inside our notes provider. So I'm going to cut that out of there and paste that in our server. And I'm going to delete the set notes thing and change this a little bit to notes equals notes.filter. And then I'm going to say const note ID equals request.params. Okay, so we're getting that note ID. We're going to have to change this thing here to note ID instead of ID. And that's pretty much all we have to do. We just need to send back the updated notes without that note in it back to the client side by saying response.json notes. Oops, not all in caps. There we go. And now back in our notes provider, let's make the corresponding request to this inside our delete note function. First of all, let's set this to an async function so that I don't forget it. Second of all, we're going to say try const response equals await axios.put. And we're going to send that request to notes slash whatever the ID of the note is that the user wants to delete. Okay, and unlike with our update note function, we're not going to have to include any kind of request body here. We're just going to have to say set notes to response.data. And then we'll say catch error, and we'll just log that error out if it happens. So console log error. And now we should be able to delete notes from the server from our front end. So let's go back to our front end here. Let's just refresh it to make sure everything's working correctly. It looks like it is. And let's click on this delete button. It's going to ask us if we're sure we want to delete this note. Oops, there we go. I did something weird. I don't know what I did. And let's click on yes. And sure enough, that will delete our note for us. So now one thing that you'll still see, however, is this little artifact, so to speak, of our old note. And the reason that that happened, I'm actually not 100% sure why, so let's just try restarting our front end and server and see if that happens again. This is usually the first step in troubleshooting, is to see if it's just a problem with our setup. So we're going to restart it and try and delete that note again. Let's delete it, click yes, and it looks like there's something there again. So let's go back and take a look at our logic inside our server.js. And that's all looking good. So let's go back to our notes provider here, I suppose, and log out the response we're getting. We'll say console.log response.data just to see what's causing that weirdness that we're seeing there. So I'm going to open up the inspector window. We're going to log it out. And let's see what this note even looks like. All right, well, for some reason, we have this ID 123 hanging around. Oh, and the reason for that is that I put axios.put. You probably caught that before I did, but that should be axios.delete. That was confusing the heck out of me. So anyway, let's refresh this now, and actually we can delete this note. We're going to say yes, and we see that we now have no notes in our application. Actually, one thing, now that we're here, and we can actually delete notes, let's change the notes page a little bit so that it displays a message there when there are no notes. This is just a little bit more user-friendly than having an empty page greeting the user. All we're going to do for that is underneath the My Notes title, we're going to have a paragraph tag with the class name that we created before of week. And inside there, it will say something like, there are currently no notes. Add one. All right. Very polite suggestion there. And what we're going to do is we're going to just check to see if there are notes. So we'll say notes.length is greater than, or if notes.length is equal to 0, rather, then we're going to display this thing. Okay, otherwise we just won't display it at all. So we can see now that there are currently no notes. If we add a new note, that should disappear. And that's a pretty good test of our entire flow here. We're going to say this is a note. Click on create. We should be able to edit this thing now, add in whatever kind of markdown we want, like that. Add some code again, blah, 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 and click on Save Changes. Sure enough, we see those changes are saved, and if we want to delete this note, we can do so again by clicking Delete, and everything seems to be working now. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.